Hello, and welcome to the Public Health Assessment, also called PHA, webinar on the Exposure Pathway Evaluation. This webinar is part of ATSDR's PHA training series. The content covered in this webinar is based on Module 4 of the online PHA training, also known as PACT. This webinar is sponsored by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, called ATSDR. For reference, you can find the presentation slides I'll be using and the recording of this webinar on ATSDR's website. The files are available in accessible format for people with disabilities. My name is Jill Dyken, and I am ATSDR's Associate Director for Science. Before I started in that role in 2020, I spent more than 20 years as a health assessor at ATSDR. And I've worked on many kinds of sites in different areas of the country. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about one of the most important concepts in our PHA process, which is exposure pathways. This evaluation is so important because when contaminants are released at a particular site, we don't automatically know if or how people living nearby might be exposed. We have to use our environmental training and site-specific information from various sources to determine if exposure is occurring and to whom. The exposure pathway analysis allows us to narrow the evaluation and more quickly take appropriate public health actions to reduce harmful exposures that may be occurring. The topic for this training webinar is based on the online training Module 4 called Exposure Pathway Evaluation. During this webinar, I will teach you about the exposure pathway analysis used to evaluate past, current, and future exposure pathways. We will also talk about how to identify exposure pathways that are completed, potential, and eliminated. This slide presents the webinar objectives. The main things I want you to take away from this webinar are an understanding of what it means to be exposed, and why conducting the exposure pathway evaluation is important in our assessment process. You should be able to list the 5 elements of an exposure pathway and how we characterize those pathways as completed, potential, or eliminated. Throughout the presentation, I'll be sharing some examples from my experience at sites across the country to illustrate some of the things you should be considering as you think about exposure elements for pathways at your site. And finally, we'll do some practice exposure pathway analysis using the Gala Lumber Company, or GLC, case study in your training, along with some other scenarios. First, let's talk through some definitions. A contaminant has to interact with the human body to be able to affect any of its biological processes. We call this interaction exposure. All contaminants have to get onto or inside the body to be able to cause any kind of harm. Exposure happens when a contaminant gets on someone's skin, or they swallow it either accidentally or on purpose, or they breathe it in. Now, I should note that some radioactive contaminants could affect the body from a distance if the radiation emitted by the material reaches the body and interacts with it. But radiation exposures are handled somewhat differently, and I'm not going to cover that in this webinar. Exposure does not always lead to health effects, but a person has to be exposed to a contaminant for it to be able to cause a health effect. That's why we covered this topic first in our PHA training. If the exposure is or was possible, then the rest of our process focuses on figuring out how likely that exposure would be to cause health effects. This is a graphic showing possible ways contaminants may move in the environment through air, water, food, or soil to get from a source such as factories at the top of the graphic to people shown in the figures down at the bottom. The question we're usually trying to answer is whether contaminants at or from a particular site could get into the environment and affect people who are living nearby. If this is happening, there has to be some way for the site contaminants to get into the environment and travel through it to reach the place where people are, so that it can get onto or in their bodies and result in exposure. This sequence of events is what we call an exposure pathway. exposure pathway is defined on this slide and is illustrated by these two boxes with the arrow between them. It's the link between some sort of environmental contaminant release or source to the point where a population might come in contact with it. There may be several different exposure pathways possible, depending on the contaminants of the site, how they reach places where people are, and the activities people could be doing in the area that might, even without their knowledge, result in exposure. We look at different exposure pathways at a site so we can concentrate our evaluation for harmful effects on the exposures that are most likely to occur. The way we evaluate an exposure pathway is by splitting the exposure pathway into 5 distinct elements, each of which has to be present for exposure to occur. I'll review the 5 elements of an exposure pathway on the next slide. The exposure pathway has the 5 elements listed on this slide: the contaminant source, environmental fate and transport, exposure point, exposure route, and exposed population. I'll be talking about each of these elements in depth in just a minute. While these are listed as 5 separate items, I recommend that you think of them like links in a chain, where the chain is the entire exposure pathway we're considering. Each one of these links has to be in place for the entire chain to hold. If we have evidence or our professional judgment tells us that all 5 of these elements are present, then we can categorize that exposure pathway as a completed pathway. The chain is solid and holding. Sometimes we may not be sure whether one of the elements is present, so we would consider it a potential pathway of exposure. But if we know that one or more of those elements will always be missing, the pathway is eliminated. So that's how we categorize exposure pathways. We need to be careful that our analysis of the exposure pathways and the categories we determine reflect the actual conditions as accurately as possible. Also, because the elements of the exposure pathway might change over time, we need to specify the time frame we're talking about. We consider exposure pathways for past, present, and future timeframes. Before I get into examples of the 5 elements, I'd like to show an overall example to illustrate the exposure pathway analysis and the classifications I just talked about. This graphic is based on the Gala Lumber Company case study that was in the online training. As indicated on this slide, I'm going to focus on this private well pathway resulting from a spill that happened at the site in the past. I have a box and arrow highlighting the first element of the exposure pathway, which is the spill of trichloroethylene or TCE that happened on the site. And the second element, highlighted and pointed to on this slide, is environmental fate and transport. This is really our understanding that the TCE spilled and filtered down through the soil to the groundwater, which in this instance is an aquifer used by private drinking wells in the area. The TCE flows in the groundwater and reaches the private wells. For this illustration, let's say we know this because we have groundwater and private well data showing TCE is present. The third element of the exposure pathway is the exposure point, which is the tap associated with the private well. The point of exposure is highlighted and pointed to on this figure. The arrow is drawn so that to the main drinking water tap in this schematic, but the exposure point could also be the bathtub, washer, or any other place the contaminated water could reach people in the home. The fourth element, which is highlighted in this box, is called the exposure route. It's kind of pointing to the same person using the tap as the exposure point element, but the exposure route refers to either the ingestion or skin contact with the contaminated water, or it could be inhalation of TCE released from the well water, for example, while showering or running the kitchen sink faucet. And the final 5th element of the exposure pathway, as highlighted with the box and arrow on this slide, is the person living in the home. So now I'd like to illustrate how we categorize these exposure pathways. the next example is going to be a first question for you to think about. So I just want to explain this first. We've got the same situation that I just talked about, and we have the same graphic based on the Gala case study. But let's say that we have these possible factors at the site, and we know there was a spill of TCE that happened in the past. And we know that people living nearby have private wells and use them, but that's all we know. So what category would you put the private well pathway in this case? Would it be completed, potential, or eliminated? Well, how did you do? The answer in this case is going to be potential. For this question, while we know the source and we know the exposure route and the exposure population are present, we're not sure about the environmental fate and transport and exposure point elements. We don't have data showing that the spill has reached the same aquifer as the private wells. And we're not sure if the groundwater flow is in a direction such that the contaminated water would reach those wells. It could, but we need more information. Thus, this is a potential pathway of exposure. I'm going to ask a second question. Let's take the same example and consider the same graphic from the Gala case study shown. Except now the regulatory folks have gone out and they've taken some samples. They've shown that the TCE is present in the groundwater beneath the spill, and they also showed that TCE was detected in the private wells. So now, how would you classify the private well pathway? The answer, of course, is completed. In this case, we have information on the links of the chain that were missing at first, the environmental fate and transport element, and the exposure point element. They've both been shown to be present. We know that the contamination is in the groundwater and that it reaches the private wells where people are using it. Now let's do a third question, again looking at the figure based on Gala. The local authorities decide to come in and put all these homes on the municipal water supply, and they close all the private wells. So how does this change the classification of the private well pathway? The answer in this case is eliminated. By taking this action, the authorities have removed this exposure point element because there's no private well tap anymore in the area. We would say that this pathway is eliminated for current and future timeframes. Now, the private well pathway would still be complete for past exposures. The answer could also be stated as completed in the past, but it's eliminated for the current and future. Remember, the 5 elements are like links in the exposure pathway chain, as shown in this graphic. They include the contaminant source, environmental fate and transport, exposure point, exposure route, and potentially exposed population. Next, I'm going to look at each link and give you some things to consider while you're trying to decide if they're present for the pathway you're evaluating at your site. I'll also give you some real-world examples from the site work I've done at ATSDR. The contaminant source is the first element of the exposure pathway. It's basically the place or the mechanism by which the contaminants are released into the environment. This could be from an industrial process, from spills, or bad disposal practices, or things like that. Because we generally work on specific sites, we can determine the source by looking at the history of the site and what it does or did in the past, considering when it operated, any actions that might have been taken to control releases over the years, and if there might be any other sites or facilities nearby that might contribute to the same kind of contamination. In many cases, you'll have an excellent idea of source areas based on past investigations at the site. This photo shows a person holding a map with color coding indicating various features of the site. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and their contractor made this map detailing their site findings at an old automobile shredder scrap metal recovery operation. It operated in Maine in the 1970s and 1980s. They gave us this map when we went out to do the site visit. It allowed us to see on paper and in person several of the areas of concern on the site, including huge piles of the leftover material called autofluff that contains several different kinds of contaminants. Then there's also the battery drop area that had high lead concentrations in the small area in the most northeastern part of the site. Each of these areas on this map can be considered a separate source. This slide has another example of a source from the site work I've done. This photo shows an orange-looking pool of surface water. It's surrounded by what looks like some old concrete structures and rocky debris. This was a mining site in Colorado. Heavy metals were leaching out in the acid mine drainage that came out of the mine, and this was joining in with some surface water streams in the area. In this case, we could identify the mine as the source, and that orange color of the water coming out of it is an indication that metals are dissolving in the acidic water that leaves the source. When evaluating the sample results coming from a site like this, you'd want to keep in mind that some areas like this might have higher natural background levels of many metals than in other areas of the country. This may not affect your assessment of exposures, but you may note that some of the exposure may not actually be site related. And this slide illustrates that you can't just go onto the site visit and immediately identify the source. The photo on the left shows a bunch of big metal transformers sitting on pallets in a dirt lot. I took this photo at a site in North Carolina where the company recycled old transformers. We know that years ago, transformers contained oil with polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs. We can easily identify leaking PCB containing oils from past operations as a source of contamination at this site. The photo on the right looks just like a grassy field surrounded by some woods, but it's also a site that was contaminated by PCBs from leaking transformers. 30 years ago, EPA went and did several cleanup actions at this site, and today you can barely tell anything was ever there. You have to be careful not to dismiss this area in your evaluations because past exposures may have been significant, even if it's cleaned up today. This is one more example of a special case we often run into. This is a picture of a small building that has a public well in a small town in Puerto Rico. The public water authorities there had found TCE contamination in 3 of the town's public wells, but the source hadn't been identified. Even if we don't know where it's coming from, finding the TCE in these public wells indicates that there is a source and that there's also transport to the public water supply, because TCE does not occur naturally. In this case, we were able to move ahead with our evaluation, and we considered drinking from the contaminated wells a completed exposure pathway. Moving on, I'm going to talk about the second element of an exposure pathway, and that's environmental fate and transport. The fate and transport of the contaminant through environmental media will bring it so that it reaches an exposure point where people are. Now, environmental media can include any substance the contaminant might adhere to, build up in, dissolve or evaporate in, or sink through that results in its movement to another location. Some of these media are listed on this slide. Those listed include air, biota, groundwater, leachate, sediments, soil gas, surface and subsurface soils, surface water, and waste materials such as sludge. This element also includes fate, which refers to whether the contaminants in these media might be broken down into other compounds. For example, sunlight might break down airborne pollutants. The breakdown products formed could be either more or less toxic than the original contaminant, so this element looks at both of those processes. The properties of both the contaminant and the environmental medium determine the likelihood of this element being significant. For example, some contaminants tend to stick to soil and sediment particles, and they don't dissolve much in water. These contaminants may not be found as much in drinking water exposure pathways, but they may contribute a lot to soil pathways. On the other hand, you might have volatile chemicals that may have all evaporated and been gone from surface soil, say at the site of a spill that happened in the past. But if they dissolved in the groundwater, they could still be a significant concern for ingestion and inhalation from well water if the groundwater moved to those wells. Volatile chemicals in groundwater could also be a concern for inhalation exposures due to vapor intrusion from soil gas into buildings. You'll usually have a pretty good idea of what environmental fate and transport properties are important based on historical studies at the site, especially if regulatory agencies are investigating the site. And so reviewing the data that are collected can confirm your initial impressions as to which media are most likely to contain which contaminants. Another great source of information is the toxicological profile that we have for the particular contaminant you're looking at. Each tox profile has a whole chapter on fate and transport issues. Now, sometimes the available data on a site only focus on the site itself, and not a lot is known about how the contaminant is moving through the environment towards potential exposure points. In these cases, it might be useful to request samples that were taken near your potential exposure points to identify whether exposure may be occurring. You may also want to seek the advice of someone with specialized experience in the situation you're looking at, like a hydrogeologist, an air modeler, or a contaminant-specific expert. I have two examples of the environmental fate and transport considerations from my site work. This first example is a picture showing what looks like a big barren hill with a huge erosion crack down the middle. It's surrounded by trees in the distance. This was a construction and demolition landfill in New Jersey, where buried waste, which was the source, was breaking down and forming hydrogen sulfide, or H2S, which has a rotten egg odor. The large volumes of H2S produced would escape out of the cracks in the landfill. And then, because H2S is heavier than air, it would flow downwind into lower elevations, and it reached the homes that were nearby. In this case, we know that the environmental fate and transport element was present because there were monitors at the landfill measuring H2S there, and there were also air monitors down in the populated areas. Those verified that the high H2S levels were present in the populated areas. Not to mention, we also had a lot of input from the people living down there who verified the presence of a strong rotten egg smell. Now, by the time ATSDR and my team got involved, the state had already installed and was operating a treatment system on the landfill gases. While the system was operating, no H2S could escape from this landfill. And that basically interrupted this transport element of the pathway and eliminated the air exposure pathway. But whenever the treatment system was shut down, the pathway was present again. My second figure shows another example of how we think about environmental fate and transport when evaluating pathways. And this map shows the site we were evaluating. It's the Radford Army Ammunition Plant in southwestern Virginia. The active part of the plant covered a large area of land situated around a horseshoe-shaped bend of the New River in the Appalachian Mountains. The New River flows from south to north on this map, and the orange area in the center is the site we were looking at. Now, ATSDR had been petitioned to look at contamination at the site and whether it was affecting drinking water in the area. We did an in-depth evaluation and found that it wasn't, because there was no completed exposure pathway for either surface water or groundwater. I'm going to talk about each one of these, surface water and groundwater, separately. For surface water, there was a source because there were several outfalls from the plant that were releasing various contaminants into the river, and these were reported on the toxic release inventory and other site documents. There were also drinking water intakes on the New River, and that would lead to a possible exposure point at people's tap. However, because the river flows north and all the drinking water intakes were south of and upstream of the site and the outfalls, the environmental fate and transport element connecting the source and exposure point was not present in this case. Similarly, for groundwater, There were several source areas of contaminated groundwater at the facility, and residents nearby used private wells, so there were potential exposure points. This map shows yellow dots in various areas surrounding the site. Those were private wells that are in use now or were in the past that we got from a well survey. And then the cross-hatched areas in the center of the map surrounding the site are areas that were not served by a municipal water system. So they could have been using private wells in those areas too. To evaluate the potential link between the source areas and the possible exposure points, we reviewed numerous site studies on contaminants and groundwater flow at each source area, looked at the science of groundwater flow, and consulted with hydrogeologists. In the end, we determined that the groundwater on the site would all flow towards the river. And because of the unique way the site was situated in relation to the river and the nearby areas with potential exposure points, site groundwater could not physically reach any well nearby. There was no environmental transport possible between the source and exposure points, and the groundwater pathway was incomplete. All right, let's go to the third element, the exposure point. The exposure point is the location where people could come in contact with the contaminant. Some examples are listed on this slide. The examples include inside a home, breathing indoor air, eating contaminated fish, game, or vegetables, accidentally swallowing dust, or drinking or showering in tap water, in residential yards, gardens, and playgrounds. That would be touching or accidentally swallowing soil or breathing air. At or near the site, contacting contaminated materials when trespassing, or on lakes or rivers by accidentally drinking water or touching sediment while swimming, wading, or boating in the surface water. The exposure point can be very specific or more general, and it really depends on how much information you have and how detailed your evaluation needs to be to reach an appropriate public health conclusion. You're going to tailor the exposure points that you look at to the information you learn about the particular site you're evaluating. You get this information from historical reports, from talking with community members or environmental officials familiar with the site, things like private well surveys or public water distribution maps, and your own observations during the site visit. The three photos on this slide are examples from my site work. The photo on the left shows a daycare center. This was taken in the town in Puerto Rico that I talked about earlier that had the contaminated groundwater. This daycare center was right near one of these suspected sources of the contamination. We were really interested in looking at the daycare center as a possible exposure point, particularly for vapor intrusion type issues indoors. The middle photo shows a bunch of trees with some houses peeking through. The trees are actually growing along a creek that has contaminated sediments, and the creek flows pretty much right through the backyards of these people's homes. We definitely look at residential yards as an exposure point at this site, as well as wading in the creek because it's easily accessible. The photo on the right is from that main auto shredder I talked about earlier. It shows the EPA and ATSDR site team actually encountering some local folks shown in the background there who were scavenging metal on the site. We knew that the site property was an exposure point for direct soil contact. Now we will move on to the fourth exposure pathway element. It's the exposure route, and that's how the contaminant is going to contact or enter the person's body. As I mentioned earlier, the contaminants need to contact or enter the body for exposure to occur, with the exception of some forms of radiation that can travel through the air and penetrate skin. In those cases, indirect exposure is possible. But to determine which exposure routes are likely for the pathway you are evaluating, you need to ask a lot of critical questions. A lot of it depends on who the exposed population is and how their specific activities and actions could bring them into contact with the contamination. For example, if a private well is contaminated, The exposure route possible depends on what the people use the private well for. If they use it for everything, then ingestion, inhalation, and dermal contact are all possible exposure routes. But if you find that they drink only bottled water, then probably only inhalation and dermal contact are important for the private well, because they'll just be showering and doing things like that with that water. If the well is one of those wells that you just use for watering the lawn and they don't let kids play in it or anything, then really there's no reasonable exposure route. In all those cases, the exposure pathway may not be complete for those uses. But if the well is present and the well is available for use, then they would still be potential pathways of exposure. Consideration of exposure route can depend on several other things besides the use. I'll go through some examples to explain some other considerations in the next slide. When we look at exposure of children to, say, heavy metals in soil, like illustrated on this photo on the left, the exposure route we normally focus on most is incidental ingestion, because kids might get soil on their hands and they could accidentally swallow some, or some kids might intentionally eat soil. We also look at the dermal route because they're going to get their hands dirty. And so if contaminants can get through the skin, then that's important. Now, for this case, the inhalation exposure route may not be very important compared to these other routes. At certain sites, though, it may be extremely important to estimate how much dust they might breathe in. For example, this photo on the right shows a site I evaluated in California. There, asbestos occurs naturally in the soil. If kids playing on or around this sports field stir up the dust, they could actually inhale asbestos fibers. And asbestos is much more toxic when you inhale it than when you accidentally swallow it. Another example along these lines is the Coldwater Creek site. This site had radioactive thorium in soils nearby, and the amount of the thorium that entered the lungs had a big effect on what the overall risk predicted from that exposure was. The exposure route element is important when you're trying to understand the contaminant's potential effects or determine what the most important routes to consider are. If you are not sure, you can always talk to a toxicologist or consult the tox profile for some information on what exposure routes are important for various contaminants. The fifth and final element of the exposure pathway is the exposed or potentially exposed population. These are the people who can come in contact with the site-related contaminants. We want to clearly think about who is exposed so that the exposure estimates we do later will best represent the exposed population. There are some considerations for populations on this slide. These include temporal and spatial relationships of the population and the contamination, community land use, site accessibility, and climate conditions. I'm going to talk about each one of these in the next few slides. The first is temporal and spatial relationships of the population and contamination. And what that means is how the relative locations of people and contamination change over time. As an example of this, I want to show this demographic map. This is a map that we made to illustrate these time and space relationships of the population around Coldwater Creek in Missouri. That's the site that had the radioactive thorium. The left-hand side of this map shows the overall view. Coldwater Creek is running, again, south to north on this map. And the two little orange dots at the bottom were the sources of contamination. These sources started contaminating the creek in the 1940s. Now, at that time, this area really wasn't developed. The population growth along the creek downstream and north of the sites here didn't really occur until the 1960s and 1970s. So we worked with our GRASP program to get the time series of demographics by decade, as shown on the right-hand side. This is for the 0 to 19-year-old age group, because we were really concerned about children who played along the creek in the past. And as you can tell in the early time frames, these densities or the color is really light. That means there's not a dense population of this age group. And it shows how the census tracts get darker and darker through the 1960s and 1970s, and then they're kind of lightening up again now. This is indicating that there were more potentially exposed children in the earlier years of this development. That is the time when the exposures were presumably higher because the contamination is washing out of the creek over time. Another consideration is the community land use and site accessibility. This slide includes some photos I took. The left and middle photos show fencing and warning signs that were put up by the EPA around some waste piles in an old building at a site in West Virginia that had concerns for lead and other heavy metals. The fencing was needed because kids had trespassed in the building in the past, and the trailhead to a popular rails to trail path, shown in the photo on the right-hand side, was right next to the site. Now, EPA had already cleaned up the path, but we wanted to look at it to think about past exposures. Or if the fencing isn't maintained, we want to consider that older kids might have trespassed or might still trespass on these other areas of the site. We want to consider that group as potentially exposed population. On the path itself, we want to consider maybe younger kids who use the path with their parents, but maybe they stay on the path. And we want to specify the age groups we're talking about and the activities they're doing that can influence their exposure. Some other examples of land use considerations for identifying exposed population can include things like whether people hunt or fish in the area, whether they eat what they catch, how many people might use private wells, or whether people swim, boat, or fish on the local rivers and lakes nearby. A final consideration in identifying who is exposed is the climate conditions in the area. Climate conditions can affect how much time people spend outside, how much time people spend inside, and what they do and how they might be exposed. This really determines more the characteristics of the community's activities than who they are per se, but it's helpful to think about with exposed populations because it can help provide more details to your exposure pathway analysis. For example, a cold climate could mean there is less chance for recreational exposure to surface water because people won't swim as much. And wearing more clothes would decrease how much skin is exposed to surface water or sediment during boating. On the other hand, people might stay inside more and have more indoor exposures. Other things climate can affect include things like whether people can contact soil or if there's snow cover part of the year. For instance, contacting soil that is very muddy would result in people having more dermal exposure. Or if the soil is very dry, then they might have more dust and more inhalation exposures. When you are describing the potentially exposed population, you want to be as specific as you can. This includes specific ages and activities that may lead to exposure. You will want to try to get an idea of the frequency and duration of these activities because this is all information that you will need later when estimating exposures. Also, note any special populations that might have different exposures or be especially susceptible to exposures. Some possible susceptible groups are listed on this slide. We normally consider women of childbearing age, the elderly, people with underlying health conditions, people with subsistence lifestyles, and transitory or seasonal residents as special groups. But it really can include anyone who might have exposures different from the norm. An example that comes to mind is one site ATSDR worked on where there was an elderly man who had lived for many years in his house that happened to be on the side of an old asbestos mine. His home was very contaminated, and his exposure, therefore, was very different than anyone else in the surrounding area. Another thing you would want to think about when looking at your exposed population is the size of the population. This could be just a few people who went down and played on the site when they were kids, or could be hundreds of thousands of people who live downwind from a company that's releasing contaminants from its stack. The number of people does not affect the quality or depth of our evaluation in any way, but it does help us determine the best way to approach and engage the community and the strategies we might recommend for reducing harmful exposures. Also, we document the number of people exposed and potentially exposed by different pathways through the site impact assessments that we complete for our work, helping us demonstrate ATSDR's overall public health impact. Thus, it's really important to get an idea of how big the population is that you're protecting. We've already gone through the 5 elements of an exposure pathway. Now let's do some practice on categorizing pathways. We're going to be using the Gala Lumber Company case study from the training. First, let's look at Operable Unit 1, where there was a TCE spill in 2003. This image zooms in on the area we will focus on from the diagram of that case study we talked about before. For this and the slides that follow for this practice exercise, we have a table that has the time frame for exposure, the contaminant source, fate and transport, exposure point, exposure route, potentially exposed population, and conclusion for the pathway. From the site reports that were available in the training, we learned that there was a spill in 2003 and that the soil where the spill occurred was quickly removed and replaced with clean soil, but the deeper soil was left in place. Let's start with exposures on site, which in this case would be workers on the site. I want to explain that ATSDR's mission focuses mainly on communities, but in our exposure pathway analysis, we often consider workers as well. We evaluate potential worker exposures to site-related contamination when the exposures are not job-related. We can reach out to our occupational health counterparts if we find that workers were or are exposed through their job-related duties. For this example, what exposure pathways are completed for this scenario for the past as well as current and future timeframes? I have some possible pathways that we'll go through together, split up by environmental medium, so we can examine this very methodically. The potential pathways include air, soil, groundwater, surface water, biota, and other. Going through all these possibilities is the best way to make sure your evaluation doesn't leave out any potentially important exposures. In later steps of our process, we often combine certain media-specific pathways for each exposed population or for scenario, such as combining exposures that a child has from eating or touching soil. But for this initial exposure pathway analysis, we like to keep all the possible pathways separate. I will go through each of these pathways individually, and we'll start with the air pathway. Again, we have the exposure pathway table, and we'll go through the elements for the past before cleanup occurred. When this spill occurred, because TCE is volatile and it evaporates quickly, we know some of that TCE would have been transported through the air. So the fate and transport pathway is complete. That's the fate and transport element is complete. We know there was a source of the spill, and we know that the fate and transport was present. If there were workers in that area at the time of the spill, then the exposure point is also present. And because the TCE would have been in the air, workers could inhale it. So there is a possible exposure route as well, and the workers were in that area. For this case, the pathway is completed for workers there at the spill site when it happened. And it could be completed for other workers if samples showed TCE was still present in the air later. Now we have the exposure pathway table with the elements repeated for past, before cleanup, and a row for after cleanup. The site summary report said that soon after the spill, the contaminated soil was removed and replaced with clean soil. Even though there might be some deeper contamination, the surface soil that workers would be near would not be releasing the TCE into the air anymore. Thus, in this case, the fate and transport issue element would be eliminated. We would categorize the air pathway as completed for that time in the past after the spill, before the cleanup, but it would be eliminated for times after the cleanup, currently, and in the future, because there's no fate and transport, exposure point, and exposure route, as indicated by these circles with lines in them in the table. Next, let's think about the soil pathway. This slide shows the exposure pathway table to consider the elements for the on-site soil pathway, where we're still examining workers in the TCE spill. The TCE was spilled directly on the soil surface, and as noted in the site summary report, later sampling confirmed the presence of TCE in the on-site surface soil. So some of the TCE was still there, even though some of it evaporated and some of it filtered down into the subsurface. Before it was cleaned up, workers could have been exposed to the TCE in on-site soil by accidentally swallowing small amounts of it or getting it on their hands. So ingestion and dermal routes were possible while they worked in the area of the spill, which would have been the exposure point. Just like the on-site air pathway, the on-site soil pathway was complete for the time before the cleanup. But the on-site soil pathway was eliminated for times after the cleanup, including current and future exposures, because fade and transport, exposure point, and exposure route were absent, as indicated by the circles with the lines through them in the table. Now we have the exposure pathway table to consider the elements for the groundwater, surface water, and biota pathways. The TCE eventually reached the groundwater beneath the site, but we learned from the site report that no one on the site has ever used the groundwater for drinking or any other purpose. Therefore, there would be no exposure point, exposure route, or exposed population in that case, even though there was a potential fade and transport element. Likewise, the spill did not reach the surface water on site. Sampling data showed that the surface water in the creek was clean, so there would be no fade and transport issue for the surface water pathway, and it's eliminated too. To be thorough, I've included the biota pathway on this slide. That is exposure to people by eating game, fish, or plants affected by the contamination. At many sites, we don't often have data on levels of contamination in biota. For this case, we can use professional judgment to eliminate the biota pathway. First of all, the contaminant of concern here, TCE, is volatile, and the area of contamination in the soil wasn't there very long because they cleaned it up right away. So any plants and animals that might have been present there wouldn't have had very long exposures at all. Secondly, TCE isn't really known to build up in tissues of plants or animals. It doesn't bioaccumulate or become concentrated higher up in the food chain. Finally, this was a fenced operating facility and fenced at the time of the spill. So the workers would certainly not have been hunting or gathering plants from the site. Even though we don't have actual data showing that biota is not contaminated, we can eliminate the biota pathway for all the time frames here as well. I would also like to note that when you're doing your own exposure pathway evaluation, it is helpful to have a table like the one on this slide to fill in all these spots for the pathway, the 5 elements, and the pathway conclusion. All right, let's do the same thing that we just did and examine off-site exposures for this example. We will use the same illustration based on the Gala case study as before. And we'll have a table on each slide for this example that has the time frame for exposure, the contaminant source, fade and transport, exposure point, exposure route, potentially exposed population, and conclusion for the pathway. In this case, although the soil at the spill was cleaned up, there was sampling that showed that TCE and its breakdown products were present in the groundwater beneath the site, and the plume of contamination did reach some homes near the site. The site report said that there were some wells that were affected by TCE. We will go through this pathway analysis and ask which ones are possible and whether they are completed, potential, or eliminated. Let's start going through the exposure pathway element table with the air pathway. We know that TCE is present in the groundwater beneath the homes, and we know that volatile chemicals like TCE can evaporate into the water in between the soil particles above the groundwater. Those air particles between the soil particles are called soil gas. The contaminants in the soil gas can move up trying to reach the air. And then often the soil gas can find cracks and other ways into homes, where it can then build up inside those residences, especially in the basement. This is what we call vapor intrusion. I'm kind of including this in the air pathway because the contaminant is present in air that people might breathe in. As shown in the table, for this example, we have a source. The contaminant source is the TCE spill. We have a pretty complicated fate and transport element, but we know that it was spilled on the soil, it went into the groundwater, and it moved to the wells. We know that because of the properties of TCE, it will also get into the soil gas. That's why there are check marks by all three of these media in the table. As indicated by the question mark in the table, we're not quite sure if it goes into the home interiors or not, because vapor intrusion is really hard to predict, and it can vary depending on the construction of the home, the season, and lots of different things. But if it does, the exposure point would be the interior of the home, and people living in the home could breathe it in. So there's a route and there's a potentially exposed population. We would classify this pathway really for all the time frames because of this question mark next to the home interiors as a potential pathway, because we're not sure if the TCE has actually come into the home interiors, but it's likely and it's possible that it did. So the next pathway we will go through the element table with is the groundwater pathway, and specifically the private well pathway. That was my example that I already talked about, which was completed for all the time frames. Because we know that the TCE was present in the groundwater aquifer used by the wells, and we knew that it was reaching the private wells, and people could be exposed by ingestion, inhalation, or dermal exposure. I'd also like to note that in a situation like this, the groundwater pathway could affect public water supplies if there are wells drawing from that contaminated groundwater. And sometimes the locations of your public water supply wells can be important because sometimes they can draw so much groundwater that it can change the expected path of that contamination plume. So you want to look at all those kinds of things. In this case, there were no public water wells in the area. Now back to our case study. This is the offsite exposures, and I will just go through soil, surface water, and biota using the exposure pathway element table. None of these media were impacted by the TCE spill because the soil offsite was not affected. They cleaned up the soil on site, and it couldn't have blown offsite or anything. Because the surface water on the site wasn't affected, it would not be affected offsite either. And biota likewise would be eliminated for the same reasons it was eliminated on site. That completes the Operable Unit 1 practice session. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about one more practice for the Operable Unit 2. Let's work through this. Operable Unit 2 is the area of the Gala site where there were logs treated with chromated copper arsenate, or CCA, where these logs were dried in the past. There was a drip pad there that operated from the early 1970s. The first figure on this slide shows that there was a daycare facility built pretty close to the drip pad area in 2005. In 2015, both the drip pad area and the daycare had soil sampling that showed higher than background levels of arsenic and hexavalent chromium, as indicated by the maps in the center and on the right, respectively. So how do we characterize the offsite soil exposure pathway? Our 5 elements to consider are listed in the table on the slide. Let's think about each one of these in turn. The contaminant source would be the drip pad area. We know that those logs were treated with the CCA, and we know that it dripped off onto the soil. Well, that's pretty much the obvious source. You might want to think about alternate sources. Is there another potential source of CCA? Well, we do know that some playground equipment may have been built with CCA treated wood in the past. In 2003, there was a voluntary phase out of using that kind of wood for residential and daycare type uses. But maybe there was some sort of holdover in use of old wood in this case. It's probably not the major contributor to contamination at the daycare facility, but something you just want to keep in the back of your mind. The second element is fate and transport. Transport could be surface water runoff when it rained, washing things into the outlying areas, or wind moving contaminated dirt. There's also the possibility that operations at that drip pad were more widespread in the past than we believe now, and maybe they used the daycare area to dry some logs. Or maybe they transported the logs over this land to get to the drip pad area. We don't really need to prove what the fate and transport was because we've sampled the exposure point and there's contamination there. You just want to have a reasonable explanation of how the contaminant moved from your source to your exposure point. The exposure route that we're going to mainly be looking at in this case is children getting dirt on their hands. So there are dermal exposure, and then they might accidentally swallow little bits of soil. So that's incidental ingestion. Also, some kids in this age range at the daycare center are likely to have what's called pica behavior, and that's where they regularly eat dirt and other non-food items. Children exhibiting soil pica behavior can actually ingest quite large amounts of soil on a regular basis. So we want to especially look at the soil ingestion route. We want to look at these children as a susceptible population as well. So the exposed population would include all the kids in this age group and those kids who are especially susceptible due to soil pica behavior, but it would also include the adults who worked in the daycare as well. Now let's think about the time frames for this exposure pathway. For the past, this pathway was completed. Then, because we haven't learned that any actions were taken at this site yet, it's still completed presently. And it will still be completed in the future if nothing changes. In a situation like this, we know the exposure pathway is happening. We know there's contamination there. Even if we know that EPA plans to clean up the site and the soil in the future, the pathway is still completed in the future until that cleanup activity takes place. You definitely want to quickly move on to your next steps in your PHA process, so you can find out if the level of exposure is high enough to increase the risk of harm to the children. This is because you want to be able to take an action as soon as possible to stop any kind of harmful exposures and eliminate the pathway for future exposures. This slide summarizes what we reviewed and practiced during this webinar. As a reminder, the 5 elements of an exposure pathway are the contaminant source, fate and transport, exposure point, exposure route, and exposed population. The exposure pathway categories include potential, completed, and eliminated. When I'm beginning an evaluation at a new site, I always think about exposure pathways and these things first, and I keep coming back to it throughout the rest of the evaluation process. That's because this objective, methodical process helps me organize my thoughts and findings, and it helps me consider all potentially important exposures. Even if we've only been asked to evaluate one data set for one particular exposure of concern, I want to have an idea in the back of my mind about what other exposures might be possible. It really helps us give a more complete message about the possible impacts of exposures in the communities we work with. Of course, determining the important potential and completed exposure pathways is really just one of the first steps in the PHA process. The training modules and webinars that come after this topic will teach you details about how we select and screen the environmental data, estimate exposures, evaluate whether the exposures from these completed pathways could be harmful to health, and how we clearly share our findings with requesters in the community. And that's the end of my webinar on the exposure pathway evaluation. Thanks for attending.